Disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent. Listener discretion is advised. It would be all too cheap and easy for me to call this episode Michael Clark's Rock and Wrestling. But we do discuss the rock and roll, and we do discuss the pro wrestling, and we talk about the art of podcasting. On this episode, I am more than happy to welcome my friend Billy Peck to the show. He's a fellow musician, he is a pro wrestling ring announcer, and he hosts his own podcast called Major World Order, which is gaining some steam worldwide as it is part of a very well-established pro wrestling network of podcasts. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Caught on the Mic. Ladies and gentlemen, after a slight two-week break, it's good to be back and doing some podcasting. This episode's a really special episode. I talk about serendipity all the time on my show. Every single guest that's been on my show, I find some sort of common ground with, and we discuss it at length. The thing that's really cool about this next guest is we're both musicians from the Omaha area. We both played in fairly successful bands, just we never got to cross paths. Funny enough, he is now a podcaster in the world of pro wrestling and involving himself in pro wrestling. And I'm now a podcaster where, I have a lot of MMA and UFC guys. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Billy Peck to the show. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for having me.
Like I told you before we started recording, I had probably my most successful single day episode to date about 3 weeks ago, right? And I'm sure you've experienced this yourself if you've ever booked guests on your show. So I had a bunch of guests teed up for the weeks after, but the weeks after that followed were Thanksgiving, week after Thanksgiving, so on and so on. I have had more reschedules in the past 2.5 weeks than I have in the past 2.5 years of doing podcasts.
Yeah, it definitely can get old, having to deal with that kind of thing. So many people have their personal lives, and the holidays come around and whatever else. And I think a lot of times as a podcaster, like, we know what it takes to put this together and whatever. And if you're like real serious about it, you want to meet deadlines, you don't want to miss your week or whatever. And others don't really quite get that. Oh, it's no big deal, we'll reschedule it. Well, I mean, that's fine, but you kind of maybe just sort of messed a whole bunch of things up.
And that's the thing. You don't want to flame your guests because they're doing you a favor, but it's really crazy because you are really knee deep in the human element. And, for my show, that's a lot of what my show is about, is about the human element. So this is like prime example in real time.
Yeah.
Without any further ado, why don't you introduce yourself and kind of give an introduction about who you are, what you're into, and what you represent.
Okay. So, boy, yeah, I do a lot of things. I'll try and keep the intro as basic as possible, and then we can deep dive as far as you want to after that. As Mike said, I've been a musician. I've been doing it for just over 20 years with several bands. I am a podcaster for just over 10 years. I have done some independent film work. I have gotten pretty heavily involved in the wrestling scene as well, professional wrestling, for about the past 3 years. Those are, again, that's the very basic of it. And then, yeah, however, whichever direction you want to go first.
Let's lead off with music.
Okay.
I know you're predominantly a bass player. Have you always just been a bass player then?
Well, so I would say that kind of has happened more recently.
Right.
I would consider myself primarily a guitarist, but I also really enjoy playing bass. And just opportunities arise and, hey, you want to do bass for this or do you want to do bass for that? And it's like, yeah, sure, why not? And over the last several years, it's very much become predominantly the bass.
Right.
So I've been a lead singer, I've been guitarist, I've been drummer. I've done a few shows as a drummer, kind of as well. I've done everything else as far as a rock musician goes. Why not try the drums a couple times?
Right. So let's talk about some of your projects. What are your most current projects that you're working with?
Currently, I have an original band called Graveyard Smash. It's a horror punk band. It was kind of just a, hey, we all enjoy horror films. We dig the Misfits. You want to put a band together. And the fun thing about it is, like I said, it's all original. I mean, with the occasional cover here or there, but original band, music's on Amazon, iTunes, Spotify, all that kind of stuff. And being a musician from this Omaha area, this may not quite, reach every listener, but from people that, are from around here that may listen, everybody in this band was very prominent in the Ranch Bowl days.
Right.
So it's a little silly to refer to it as like a super group, but as far as like Omaha musicians go, it's kind of a super group of people. You have Lawrence Deal, who is the lead singer, who was in so many bands back in the day and still doing a lot. What was his main band?
He was in Gage and Civic Minded.
Civic Minded, thank you.
Yep.
So yeah, he Civic Minded was like I think like his bigger one from back in the day. Brandon Voorhees was in a lot of bands. So him and Kevin Henricks, who are the two guitar players, they came from a band called For Never back in the day. Brandon has been in Diesel Breath, a lot of like metal bands and hardcore bands, and then he went off to like play with like hardcore bands, like touring with like Marauder and bands like that. And then our drummer Dale Steinhoffel, he was in a band called Eyes Catch Fire that did very well back in the day. And then I was in a band called Sin. We've all done so many things since then, but
Right.
If you kind of take it back to those Ranch Bowl days, like those were all bands that were playing the Ranch Bowl, which, for people that again aren't from the Omaha area, it was, one of the most famous, I suppose, lower tier music venues in the country. Bands like White Zombie, Pantera, Slipknot, and so many got their starts there before they went off to, superstardom.
I always refer to the Ranch Bowl as the Forrest Gump of music venues.
Sure.
Because it's had so many brushes with history and unintentional brushes with history.
Sure.
Every band before they became big set foot in the Ranch Bowl.
Right. I remember seeing Green Day a few years back, and they were just like, hey, we used to play the Ranch Bowl, and now it's a Walmart. And look, the bands like that, like whether you like or dislike, does it get much bigger than Green Day and things like that? Like, not really,
Right.
and for them to be like, they have such an affinity for the Ranch Bowl, and we were playing those shows,
Right.
that venue. So
Yeah.
that's where this band all derives from, pretty much. Graveyard Smash.
Yeah. And then your other project, you are currently playing bass with Secret Weapon, which is basically kind of the same caliber. It's basically the cover band super group of the area.
Right. Yeah. 100%. I don't know all their history as well. I'd really have to think about it, but yeah, it's all guys that again came from all kinds of, bigger bands, whether it was original or cover bands, and just, they all came together 17 years ago, I believe.
Yeah. I've got a story about that. So,
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Back in the day when we were doing the No Pride Records thing.
Oh man. What?
Yeah.
That's a name I forgot about.
Yeah. I remember the whole idea for Secret Weapon being conceptualized at a No Pride Records meeting.
Okay. Yeah.
So again, long before it happened, but I remember whenever it was like the concept was talked about.
Sure. Yeah, again, you've got, Phil Reno, who's considered maybe the best guitarist in town.
Right.
He also came from Civic Minded with Lawrence, yeah, back in the day, and Benji, one of the lead singers. He played in like all like the main pop punk bands back in the day. Straight out of junior high. A few others, and Scott Armstrong's in it, who was also in Forever. It's so
Yep.
funny. Music is so incestuous.
Oh yeah, especially in Omaha, man.
Right. And then
Especially in Omaha.
just to, give shout outs, you got Scott Evans on the drums and Larry on the vocals. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just
Insane group of guys.
yeah. Well, it's a lot of fun. And I'm very honored to be playing with really all of these people because of their lineage and their talent and all of that. So as far as like my current bands go, those are the two. And Secret Weapon is a super fun 80s cover band, and it has won Omaha's Best Cover Band award for like, I don't remember exactly. I want to say it's like 12 out of the 17 nominations that it's had or something like that. So, very renowned band in town that I'm lucky to be part of.
So you've been doing the band thing for a long enough period of time in Omaha. What would you say is the biggest change from playing in bands in the pre-social media era to the era that we're living in right now? Because it's two different things, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. I'm lucky to kind of had one foot in each. But like, when I was in Sin, and that, I mean, I was in some bands prior to that, but that was like kind of like my first real original band, and really doing some cool stuff. And MySpace was hot at the time, and so there was a bit of being able to network through social media. Boy, but what is the big difference? I mean, the kind of the old adage of flyering,
Right.
street teams, having people, your fans, wanting to help you and go out and handing out flyers or CDs or whatever outside of big festival shows or something, like, hey, we're going to be playing later tonight or next week or whatever.
Right.
And so there's that, and I know that there's still a little bit of that, but not the way that it used to be. And so much of it is now just like have a great flyer or online presentation that it's getting people to recognize you on Facebook,
Right,
or
right.
Instagram.
And what I'm kind of teeing you up to is it's almost like there's a lot of cross-pollination between the three specializations that you hold, right? There's a lot of cross-pollination between how you are a successful local musician, how you are successful in the realm of local pro wrestling, and how you become successful as a podcaster, because each thing borrows from the other thing to a certain extent.
100%. Yeah.
Right.
So much of where and it's actually very interesting how much it comes full circle, and we'll get into, I'm sure, some of that a little more later. But I've always been the type of person that I pull inspiration from many facets of entertainment.
Right.
Primarily, like, always, like, my main love and goals were always, be a successful musician. But I would always learn from other aspects of entertainment, whether it was wrestling or comedy or movies. It's all people who are working very hard to be noticed, I suppose.
Right.
And how do you, I could use that, or I could use that. And you have to like just hone that all into promoting yourself.
That's kind of where my mindset has changed. Like, pre-social media, your art was the brand. In a post-social media world, you are the brand. And people that get that become more successful than the people that are still trying to fight it and still trying to be beholden to the old ways of things.
Yes. and I don't. I mean, yeah, you're right, and it's interesting. Like, I don't, want to. I'm not talking negatively about anyone, but like you said, people holding on.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, when I was in Sin, it did pretty well for a while, and at a certain point, you kind of just start to realize and know when things are not firing on all cylinders, whether it's the band's fault or just the market or whatever. You do something for long enough, it can become stale. You need to revitalize yourself.
Right.
I had suggested like a break for the band, and it had been going for like 8 years straight with no breaks ever. So it's like, look, we had like 6 months or something before our next gig was like officially booked. It's like, hey, you know what? Let's take a little break. Let's recharge, come back, like, and start writing the music, this or that, whatever. And it was not looked at very positively at that time. And because it was the grind, you can't stop, you can't leave, you can't whatever. And I felt not only like did the band just need a break itself, but you give it a little break from the people, leave them
Mm-hmm.
wanting more, let them kind of like not necessarily forget, but not have it be the forefront of their mind.
Right.
And when you decide like, all right, bam, we're back, here's some new stuff, here's a big show or something. um and again, like, that all is still, it's part of the promotional process.
Right.
um at a certain point, um things didn't quite work out. They decided they wanted to just keep going, and I just didn't feel it was right. I left. Everything was fine. I very much, as you were starting to talk to, I started working on my brand,
Right.
putting me out there. And I loved it, and I put so much of everything I had into that band, but it's like, what if I do all of that just for me?
Right.
And at times, like, I've I've felt selfish for it too, because it's like, like, it's all about me. I don't want it to be all about me, but you have to make you work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really started to put a lot into myself, and then that's just when more opportunities started to come my way.
Yeah. Momentum is a really dangerous beast, and it's a really poisonous drug sometimes, because you can be a part of this creative endeavor and you're always looking for your next fix. You have a big show, you have a ton of people show up, and then you start getting picky about what show you're going to choose next because you want to build on what you built on that last show, right? And sometimes waiting for that next right opportunity, you miss a lot of really good smaller opportunities.
Absolutely.
But that's the thing, and that's where a lot of bands and a lot of people and a lot of creatives in general end up staying in something for too long, because they're basically just trying to feed the momentum of their last big thing without realizing it might have already passed. It might already come and gone. And I talked about that on the very first episode of my show when I talked about the history of Arasing. The last two shows we did were the two biggest shows we ever did. And my mindset at the time was, I'm a hip hop guy too. I think about Jay-Z's Black album, because that was supposed to be his retirement album, where I was just like, you know what? There's no more gangster move than to go out on top if you know that you're not going to top that.
But I bet there was probably that little bit of like, oh, is this a mistake? No. Oh, okay.
When honestly, I think that was the most honest I'd ever been about myself and to myself. Whenever the bandmates from that band and I are all still like really good friends. They're still some of my best friends, but that was the hardest goddamn conversation I've probably ever had.
Well, right. And for those reasons, it's why it is difficult. Right. And like you said, you can stay for too long. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those reasons is, complacency. What is it going to be a mistake? Am I letting my friends down that I've been doing this with for so long. Like, you become so connected with these people more than almost anybody, more than family members sometimes.
Right. Let's kind of shift gears, since we are talking about this cross-pollination of our different sets of interests, because I'm a huge wrestling fan too. I just haven't watched it as much in recent years.
Sure.
And I feel like wrestling has had, the highlight is always going to be, the 1980s, and then the first renaissance would probably be the Attitude Era, the Monday Night Wars era. And I feel like wrestling has had 2 or 3 more renaissances, particularly in the past 5 to 10 years, as it's constantly reinventing itself. And so in that time, you've leaned into your wrestling fandom, got involved with a local promotion, but you've also become a wrestling podcaster. So which came first?
It would have been the local wrestling. Yeah. All pretty close to each other, but it was local wrestling first. I started going to the local promotions in town just as a fan. I became friends with the promoter of PWP. His name's Chris Havius. And just over time, we hit it off well, and they were getting ready to do an out-of-town event, and their ring announcer was unable to make it. So they're thinking of, okay, who can we get? And they asked me just to fill in. And then from time to time, I just, once every couple months would do another one if they needed me. And then at a certain point, they asked me to start doing it full time. And the main reason why they reached out was because, because of music, they knew that I had a stage presence. One of my biggest things about music is, you always want to be a good musician and perform well, but I've always considered myself an entertainer. I've always liked, putting on a show, having some sort of theatrics. And so through all of that, I knew how to talk to a crowd and how to perform. And that's what they wanted. They wanted someone, that was entertaining. I mean, like, I'm not out there, like doing crazy antics or anything as a ring announcer, but I know how to present myself.
Right.
So they asked me to do that, and I've been doing it for about 3 years.
Right.
And then, and it's a crazy story, but yeah, then I started getting involved in wrestling podcasting.
So let's talk a little bit about the wrestling promotion side of things.
Yes.
Because I too got involved with the local wrestling promotion for a very short period of time. I had a friend that was a pro wrestler. So I got to ask you, because to my audience that is not familiar with wrestling terminology, let's clear that up.
Okay.
Heels are the bad guys. Baby faces are the good guys. A work is the actual production that you're putting forth, and a shoot is when somebody breaks character and actually speaks as their individual self, right?
Yeah, that's all pretty close. Yeah.
Okay, so my question for you, being involved with a local wrestling promotion, and this is going to be a loaded question, who's more dramatic? Is it local musicians or local wrestlers?
Well, oh boy. Okay, so I'm pretty lucky. A lot of the wrestlers that I work with are not too dramatic, but there are some that are, yeah.
It's kind of crazy, and I don't want to get into the business of talking shit or anything along those lines, and that's not where I'm going with this. But the reason I brought forth that wrestling terminology before I brought into this conversation is a lot of pro wrestlers that I have been friends with, sometimes they get caught in a moment where you don't know where the character starts and the character ends.
That very much can definitely be a thing. Yes, wrestling is such a weird thing, especially because, like, and this would just be getting into the weeds of it. So I'll try and keep it simple. But, wrestling came from, carnivals and circuses way, 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 way back in the day. With wrestling coming from the carnival days, where, it's almost a magic show. And, you always hear, fake, scripted, rehearsed, all of that. They very much wanted people to believe that what they did and who they were was real, where essentially it's a live movie or theater. But when someone in the theater comes off of stage, they're not their character anymore.
Right.
In wrestling, when you run into them, outside of the venue after a wrestling match, they stayed in character.
Right.
So now they have this weird dichotomy of you have to live your life, but you also have to live this wrestling life. And sometimes that comes together and they don't know how to separate it anymore. And that's where what you're talking about comes from.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's just the emotional intelligence to learn to compartmentalize that to a certain degree. And that's not a skill that everybody has. Like duality and cognitive dissonance is not everybody's strong suit. So I always found it very interesting. And again, I got to qualify this and say, I'm not talking shit, but it is something that it's a very anomalous thing that I've seen happen frequently, and it almost cracks me up.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So there's how many local wrestling promotions in the Omaha and Lincoln area? I believe there's about 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Last I counted.
Yeah. 2 for sure.
Right.
And then there's been a couple that have like kind of popped up and went away. And, there's like, the Lincoln and Sioux City kind of areas. There's a couple. And then like you start to get to Des Moines, there's like another 3 or so. So
right.
There's a lot like in this Midwest area, but in Omaha specifically, there are 2.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of where I wanted to draw attention to the fact that I don't think people realize how much of a pro wrestling hub Omaha has been. The old smoke pit, the old barbecue place that used to be downtown, they had legendary stories of all the old school WWF and NWA wrestlers coming to that restaurant just because it was the spot whenever they were coming to town.
Yeah. Again, trying to keep it all simple. The Midwest was huge. I mean, wrestling has been spread out all over the world, but the Midwest was very big in the 70s, 80s, sometimes even a little, earlier than that. And, it was people could just like straight shot from Minnesota down through, Iowa or Nebraska, down to Kansas City, down to Texas, and and up, right. So you had that straight line of some of the biggest wrestling ever, and the cool thing about the Omaha Lincoln area is it is smack dab in the center of the country,
right?
So everything could just come right there.
Yep, for sure. And if you're lucky in recent years and you're hanging out in West Omaha, you too might run into the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase.
It's possible.
I heard this story a few years ago about him being at the CarMax out by Village Point, and I thought that was fantastic stuff.
Well, and he's originally from Omaha.
Absolutely.
Spent a lot of time here. So
your podcast is Major World Order, MWO, as in Mike, MWO, and it is a part of the Major Wrestling Figure Podcast Network. Brian Myers and Matt Cardona, formerly known as Zach Ryder. So how did you get involved with that group of characters and move your podcast forward?
So, and it's you think about it, like it is kind of a silly story, but uh, I been a big fan of Matt Cardona and Brian Myers, or for those who might remember, like whether where you were watching wrestling. Zack Ryder was definitely more popular at the time, but like they were part of the Edge Heads, which they were the two guys that looked just like Edge, and they helped him win the title and stuff like that. Zack Ryder, when they split as a team, Zack Ryder became very big with the internet crowd. He started like a YouTube show and all this stuff, and started to, and a wrestling term, but he started to get himself over. He started to popularize himself outside of the WWE system. So, flash forward a number of years, Matt Cardona and Brian Myers start this wrestling figure podcast, the Major Wrestling Figure Podcast. Major is because they were the Major Brothers as a tag team at one time as well. So, here it's a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche is really what this ends up being. 1, wrestling podcast. 2, wrestling podcast about action figures.
Right.
Predominantly wrestling action figures. And people right there are going to be like, you can do a podcast about wrestling figures? Even in their very first episode, they're like, it was like 45 minutes long. They're not going to, do like have separate social media accounts for it or this or that or whatever. Now episodes can go upwards of 3 hours at times, and they have all this social media. They have an entire team that works for them. It's done very well. They have a Patreon community, a private Facebook group, and you pay a little fee and you can be in that group. And kind of what it started as was a place where, a private place where people can buy, sell, trade, whatever, with each other. And the cool thing about it was they're in the group as well. And from time to time, they would bring along a wrestling friend that is also in the group. So you are mingling with these professional wrestlers. And over time, the community, I mean, it is still a place where you can buy, sell, trade, but it's formed a lot of really great relationships. And through that, I got to know a couple guys there. One lives in Connecticut, one lives in Florida. We had never met personally, but we just all became really good friends. And on the podcast, you would start to hear they would talk about like interactions they had with people within the group, and you would start to hear these people's names, just fans names popping up from time to time. I happen to be one of them. The guys that I, had the podcast were, and so were several others. And it just struck me because I'd been podcasting other things as well. And it just struck me as like, this community is so cool. There's so many characters within it. We hear their names and kind of get to know them a little bit. I wonder what it would be like to do a spin-off show of the Major Wrestling Figure Podcast where we interview the people of the community.
Right.
And even, more than that, from time to time, we might get Matt Cardona on, or Brian Myers, or another, the other host is Smart Mark Sterling, who is a pretty predominant manager in AEW right now.
Yeah.
And, we get them, we start to get, some of their friends on, we start to learn more and more about them and each other. And it's just a fun interview show where we talk about collecting and get to know each other more.
Yeah.
So over time, and they embraced it instantly, started sharing it, started talking about us. all wanted to come on the show.
Right.
A lot of cool things. And over time, I started to get even more in with them specifically. They do these live shows all over the country where they do like a live podcast and meet and greets and stuff. They started asking us to do like host their after parties at these things. And then just the more and more that I got to know them and whatever, like now I work for them.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
And then our podcast became part of their network as well. So just super cool.
One of the things that I've observed as a wrestling fan myself is an art form that's so predicated on conflict, how easy it is to form a brotherhood with people that are also into that same thing. It's like I some people use it as a derogatory term, but the marks have their own community. And it is amazing to see. You know, you might not agree on, you know, who we like versus who we don't like, which organization we like versus the one we don't like, but it's pretty amazing how tight-knit the wrestling community has been. So as a podcaster and as somebody that's been involved in the wrestling world, what's been your experience with wrestling fandom compared to other things? Because you really think about it, sometimes like comic book fandom's kind of toxic anymore. Star Wars fandom is kind of toxic anymore. But wrestling fandom has been pretty consistent.
Sure. And I mean, look, it can have its toxicity as well. Unfortunately, every form of fandom does at this point. And yeah, I mean, wrestling, you know, the bigger picture of it, you know, it's definitely there. Right. This smaller section of it, like, it's still there a little bit. But overall, you know, it's still pretty good. And, you know, so yeah, I've had my fair share of having to deal with a few things here and there. Like one of my jobs now for them is like, I'm the moderator of their Facebook group and their Patreon.
Right.
So now I have to deal directly with when people start having infighting with each other or whatever. So it definitely exists, but it's not nearly as bad as it is in other places, which is nice.
Sure. So with having these different interest spectrums in your life, you know, and you can kind of look at it and you have the power of looking at things in hindsight. What fills your cup more these days?
Oh man, it's interesting because I do think about this from time to time, fairly often actually. Wrestling has really consumed so much of my life. And I mean, yes, I'm a ring announcer, I'm a podcaster, I'm able to go and travel to these shows, you know, for the Major Wrestling Figure podcast, and I mean, I moderate their Facebook, I help run their social media, I edit video and stuff for their pay-per-views. Like, so much stuff has come up, and even just very, very recently, I've wrestled 2 matches now.
Yes, I just saw that.
And, you know, and look, I am not a wrestler. I'll put that out there. What I've done, and it has been, you know, somewhat gimmicky as far as wrestling. I've been in, like, you know, over the top battle royals or like 4-man or 8-man tag matches where I'm with 3 other people on a team. I'm instructed to do a small amount of stuff, and then that's kind of it.
Right.
But I'm literally working on wrestling stuff every single day and like legit talking with one of my all-time favorite wrestlers every day. And it makes me go back and look at, like, I mean, I'm right next to my band room with all my, you know, all my guitars and amps and drums and, you know, the PA. And I'm like, how did this happen? Like, at one point, that was the thing that consumed everything. And like, I just played a show the other night, and I have plenty of shows booked. But as fun as that stuff is, like, and maybe it's because it's new and fresh, but oddly enough, like the wrestling thing it maybe edges it out a little bit.
Yes, that was totally loaded and intentional, because as I said at the beginning of the podcast, we have so many serendipitous parallels, like you and I do. And I think about the same thing. I think about podcasting versus all the years I spent grinding in music. I feel I did fairly well for myself in music, but I walked away when it was right for me to walk away. But then I look at the past 2.5 years of podcasting, and I'm like, I am regularly talking to some of the people that inspired me to play music, some of the athletes that I love watching, some of the doctors or documentarians that create stuff that stimulates my mind on a regular basis. So when people ask me to compare the world of podcasting that I'm in now versus the world of music that I used to be in, it's really hard. I have like an internal battle with it.
Yeah, you almost don't want to admit it.
Right. That's exactly it. It's like, oh man, I got to go pull up an old one of my albums or something and listen to it just so I can remind myself it's because of this why you're doing this. This is what brought you to this dance,
Yeah, and it is. I mean, and funny enough, when my very first podcast, so I'm a big horror movie fan.
Right.
And my nickname is Zombilly.
Right. Yep.
And I legit started a podcast so I could talk about horror movies, and it was called Zombilly's Horror Hour.
Yeah.
But it was also a vehicle to try to push music more. It was me trying to get noticed a little bit more in this realm. That also was like a backdoor to, but pay attention to the music.
Right.
It was still about the music. The music is what got me into being a ring announcer. They watched me on stage and were confident in my abilities there to be like, oh, you can do this for wrestling. And so it really all falls back to being a musician and just wanting to, I don't know, do a good job and get myself out there.
The different forms of content you create can kind of be a checks and balance for each other to a certain degree.
Sure.
And this is a really good topic for today, because my son called me this afternoon and he saw one of the TikTok videos I created, and I try and do at least 1 minute video every single day because it helps generate listenership to the podcast. And again, it's establishing me as a brand, right? So I put up a video of some old band clips and say, hey, this is the thing that got me to podcasting, from musician to podcaster, and here's the clip. And my son, who was an infant the last time I was doing music, calls me up and he goes, are you going to start playing music again? I'm like, no, why do you think that? He said, I just saw your TikTok video and I thought you were making an announcement of some sort. I'm like, no. But I mean, it's really crazy because it's almost like there's different compartments of your life that just bleed over into one another.
So let me ask you this. You said that he was an infant, like the last time you were really doing it?
Yeah.
He's never really got to see you do it.
No. He was, I think when I played my last show, he was 3 years old.
Is there a part of you that makes you want to, like, look, Arsing did very well here, and I'm sure it wouldn't take much to do a one-off show.
Dave Campbell.
Something that I was going to say, Dave Campbell very well could listen to this.
Oh, Dave Campbell, a mutual friend of ours.
Yeah.
He, for a while there, he was posing that to me, I think, once every 3 months.
Yeah.
So, sir, what would it take for you to do a reunion show, sir? And
You're doing the voice and the sir.
And I'm like, it ain't gonna happen. It's really, and now I'm not gonna lie, like it's crossed my mind from time to time where I'm like, God, it would be really good to feel that energy again. But at the same time, I made such a peace with it. I was so at peace with stopping that I feel like it's a really slippery slope. And it's just not even who I am anymore. So I
know that there's a lot of people that like to, like, if they've been done with something,
right?
But like their kids never really got to see it. It's like, well, I'd like to do it at least once for them to see, like, hey, this is what Dad did.
Right.
You know, and it almost seems like there was like a spark for him. Was like, Dad, what is this? Like, that was really cool. Like, I just didn't know if it, even to a certain degree, made you go, maybe just once, just to, you know, show my son, like, I mean,
I'll tell you this.
One of the most important parts of your life, really.
Right. I run on a treadmill every day. Like, I will run 20 minutes to 45 minutes on a treadmill every day. And I have never said this to anybody before, so you're the first, and now my audience is going to be the second to hear this.
Oh, baby.
But every time I'm on that treadmill, if I'm listening to a mix of music, I envision myself performing said music. Like, it doesn't matter who the artist is that's doing it, but I envision myself on stage performing said music. So in that moment, I do kind of get in my own head and be like, man, do I have one more in me someplace? But usually once the endorphins calm down and I'm back on planet Earth, it's like, oh, fuck that shit.
That's funny.
So what kind of things do you have coming up? What are some big events coming up with the podcast? What's some big events coming up with wrestling? And what's coming up with music?
I just came off of a pretty heavy month of doing stuff. No gigs currently booked for Graveyard Smash, because we just did one a few days back. Secret Weapon doesn't have anything this month, but we'll pick back up in January. So its next event, and this is, exclusively for, people, in the Omaha area.
Sure.
If you want to come see a cool, fun 80s tribute or cover act, whatever you want to call it, we'll be playing at a venue called Barrel and Vine on January 6th. PWP, Omaha's longest running wrestling organization, going on just over 17 years now. Its next event will be on December 29th at the Waiting Room Lounge in Omaha, Nebraska. Then I will be in Florida, Orlando, Florida, with the Major Wrestling Figure podcast on January 21st. They have a live event coming up where, again, it's just a live podcast, but it's more than just a live podcast. Like, they're putting on a show. And they are bringing all kinds of guests on. Like, their this last one in Florida last year, they had Kevin Nash there. Nice. Or the last event that I was at in Boston, John Cena's dad was there.
Oh, cool.
And so, a lot of fun stuff. And, I help with a lot of things there, and will more than likely kind of be like introing the show there and kind of ring announcing, so to speak, for that. And then, so that, those are the main three things, as far as like things you can come see me do, or four things, I should say: Graveyard Smash, Secret Weapon, PWP, Major Wrestling Figure podcast.
With all your scope of interest and everything that you're into, everything that you do, you have a lot on your plate.
Yes.
Given all of that, given all of everything that we've discussed in this episode of the podcast, what is Zombilly's advice for making the world a better place the way we see it right now?
Oh, wow. Just be nice. Look, Bill and Ted, they said it best. Be excellent to each other. So there's so much bullshit out there. And look, I get it, whether it's you like this thing more than you like that thing. Look, at the end of the day, so many people, it's the Pepsi versus Coke thing.
Yep.
And you can apply that to anything. Pepsi, Coke, Xbox, PlayStation, and the big one, Democrat, Republican. Look, you can have the side of whatever it is that you choose. Realize that we are all people.
Yes.
Realize that if you actually got to know each other more than just behind a computer screen or putting everything you have into liking this one thing, you probably have way more in common with this person than you want to believe.
Yep.
And that one aspect, and yeah, you can have viewpoints that are way extreme and it's like, oh man, I can't associate with that. Whatever. But not everybody's like that.
Right.
Set some of those differences aside and find that common ground.
Yes.
It's not hard to be nice and get along with each other.
Yes. That's perfect. That's a perfect spot to wrap this up with. Billy Peck, thank you very much for doing the show. The world is a better place with you in it, my friend.
Well, thank you.
I want to once again thank Billy for doing the show today. Make sure you check out all of his projects online. Search out the bands Secret Weapon and Graveyard Smash. Look for PWP Pro Wrestling. And most importantly, check out Major World Order Podcast on your favorite podcasting platform. It's a big deal, folks. As I said at the jump, it has been a few weeks since I've recorded a podcast. Make sure you're still following me on all forms of social media. Check me out on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Visit me at www.caughtonthemic.com. This has been Caught on the Mic with Michael Clark. I'm Michael Clark. Until next time, thank you.